In this podcast, I'll be looking at the art of interviewing for the radio documentary. I will be joined by Costing the Earth, Countryfile and Panorama presenter Tom Heap, who for many years has not only been the voice, but the face of environmental programmes on the BBC. I started by asking Tom how he decides the style or tone of the interview he is doing for any given programme.
The tone and type of the interview is really decided by what it is you want to get out of it. I suppose you could break it down into three. Is it something where you want the person to give you information, pure and simple, paint a picture of where they are? Is it something where you want them to give emotion, their feelings about whatever has happened or whatever the subject of the interview is? Or is it something where you're trying to get a revelation, maybe a revelation that they don't necessarily want to give if you're after a newsline? That in turn decides the tone. If it's one that's seeking them to give enthusiasm, for instance, the way you approach it, it helps if you're enthusiastic, and then they in turn will find the space to give enthusiasm and emotion. If it's one where you're getting them to describe things, you don't want to give them too much information because you want them to fill the space with their knowledge. Sometimes you ask leading questions in order to do that. Other times you kind of lead it open. What the first question is really dictated by, once again, what the style of interview is. Very often I don't ask the hardest question first because I don't want them to immediately clam up and think this is going to be something hostile. So even if it's an interview where I'm seeking a newsline or seeking some kind of revelation, I will rarely start in with the hardest of questions because I simply don't want them to be on their guard straight away. I'd rather get a bit of conversation flowing, a bit of feeling of confidence, and then maybe bring in something a little bit harder. And the same really applies to the third thing here. How do you get interviewees to open up? If they know that you are seeking information, after all, most interviews, contrary to what the public fear, having seen Humphreys and Paxman et al., most interviews are about getting the individual to state what they believe clearly and passionately. They're not usually about tripping them up. So the more you can put them at their ease and get them to express themselves in a clear and conversational way, the better. So I'll try and get interviewees to be confident in me and understand what it is that we want to get out of them. I don't like rehearsing too many questions, but I will sometimes let them know what the first one is just to put them at their ease. And then otherwise, different interviewees open up in different ways. Some people respond to, if you like, a bit of banter. Other people like a bit of clarity, and if you like more formality. That really does depend on who you're talking to. If the interviewee doesn't want to answer the tough question, that really depends on what style of interview it is. If it is a live interview, often the best option is to make it very apparent to a listener that they are not answering the tough question by either asking it repeatedly or in different ways that makes it very apparent they're simply avoiding the subject or avoiding the response that you want them to give or that would provide clarity because they simply don't want to give clarity. And you end up illustrating to the public you end up illustrating to the listener that their avoidance speaks volumes in and of itself. In a recorded interview, that can be more difficult, and I've done a number of recorded interviews for Costing the Earth or Panorama or things like that, where the skilled interviewee knows that you will not use 3 or 4 minutes of them avoiding the question, and so up to a point, that's where their skill comes in. You can make it as apparent as you possibly can, or you can make it sound like they're dancing around the subject, but you've got to be careful that you're not using too much of the hubris and anger of the interviewee just to show that you're giving them a good turning over, rather than the thing that you need to concentrate on is providing information to the audience. There aren't really times, I don't make a judgment particularly about whether I like or don't like the interviewee, so I don't think this subject of how treating them fairly comes up. I would say sometimes when we think an interviewee has done a particularly poor job, and there was an example of this very recently in a current affairs documentary that I did, that we were aware that we could make the interviewee very easily look quite absurd, and we ended up trying to find bits of the interview where we felt he didn't look absurd in order to balance those with ones where he did. Best interview? Difficult to say. I mean, there are ones where people have just revealed things. I interviewed Princess Anne for Countryfile. I felt it went very well because she revealed some newsy things, like she's in favour of gassing badgers, she's in favour of GM, and when I asked her about eating horses, not only did she say she thought it was a good idea, but she said they tasted quite good actually when I asked her what they were like. So that was an example of a good one. I think others where there was one I did for Costing the Earth recently where the character of the woman, it was about urban cycling, the character of the woman just came across so strongly. I realised that she was quite a lively, bubbly person who'd recently gained the confidence of the city through cycling, and it was just one of those interviews that you came away thinking that worked really well. You could feel her vivacity, excitement coming through the radio. What's been my worst? There was one when I was working for News and was doing live interviews on the final flight of Concorde, and I turned to say, and you can just hear Concorde landing behind me on its final flight, and with me to discuss the significance of this moment in aviation history is I'm terribly sorry, sir, I've forgotten your name. That still sticks with me, as you can tell. There have been other ones, perhaps more recently. There was one I did on energy for Panorama, where I felt I really hadn't been able to lay a glove on a particularly slippery minister. And I went back over it again and thought, could I have done it better? But this individual was very practiced at doing that thing I mentioned earlier about evading the question when they know you're very unlikely to use the clear evidence for them avoiding it because it only emerges over the space of 3 minutes. You're never going to give it that amount of time. One other poor interview that sticks in my head is one where the production team had given me literally about 50 questions to ask. Now, there is no way you can deliver a good interview with that level of questions, so a bit of focus is always important for an interview. What's the difference between interviewing for radio and TV? It's more there are differences. Clearly with the radio, very often between you and the interviewee, if it's a kind of show and tell for radio, you both need to talk about what it is around you or what it is that is so compelling. If it's a visual thing, you need to clearly illustrate that in your conversation. Radio interviews usually allow more expression of personality, more expression of individual narrative than television, and so it's up to you to make sure those are given. And finally, I said quite often you can allow radio interviews to go a little bit longer because simply it's a factor, because let me rephrase that. Usually television interviews tend to be shorter than radio or have fewer questions, not least because with television you're likely to want to do the questions on a reverse and then a different angle and and if you focus down on the 5 or so things you really want to ask, the better that is. Sometimes with the radio you can go on slightly more fishing trips and go down a few angles to see if you can elucidate something unexpected or unusual. But beyond that, I don't see a massive difference between the two. And that comes to the final thing you've asked, which are the 3 top tips for interviewing. I would say those are the same for radio and television. You want to get brevity, you want to get clarity, and you want to get enthusiasm. And the most important of those, in my book, is always enthusiasm and passion. In the end, we as the producers, we in the script, can give information. We can give clarity, and we can do it quickly. What we can never do is put that person's human response into whatever it is we're talking about. So in the end, that's the principal thing you need to get out of the interviewee, their humanity, their response to that. And I suppose if it is a news interviewee, some kind of revelation of something you haven't heard before.
That was Tom Heap talking about interviewing for the radio documentary. However, not all radio documentaries are the same, and not all guests are homogenous. In next week's podcast, I'll be talking to former music radio presenter and documentary maker Robin Valk about the skills needed as well as some useful tricks of the trade when interviewing musicians. Until then, goodbye.